Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. Many thanks for inviting me. My name is Nick Perry, and my thanks go to Brendan and to the Cavan Library for organizing this event and for the great work they've been doing during this centenary period. I'm now going to share my screen. My subject this evening is this man, Major General Oliver Nugent, who commanded the Ulster Division during the Great War, but who in 1922 was living in retirement at Farranconnell, his home in South Cavan. In April 1922, on hearing that anti-treaty forces had seized the forecourts in Dublin, he wrote in his diary, shown here, "I think this is probably our last year here. I do not think it likely that there will be any place for me in the new order when and if it comes." The new order he was referring to was victory by the anti-treaty forces, and it's a measure of how far he had traveled politically that the existing order for whose survival he so fervently wished was no longer British rule, but a government headed by Michael Collins. In the end, he and his family didn't leave, for reasons we'll come to. But when he wrote those words, there seemed many reasons why he should. By the spring of 1922, it was clear to him, as it was to others, that the country, having come through the trauma of the War of Independence, was teetering towards civil war. And in the first few months of 1922, following the formation of the new Free State government, there had been a series of incidents that seemed ominous for former Unionists like him. His hay barn had been burned down by armed men. His car had been commandeered by the IRA. His close friend, Lord Farnham, had moved to England, fearing for his and his family's safety. And a terrified Protestant neighbour, intimidated off her farm, had arrived at his door late at night seeking shelter, and there were rumours that Nugent and other local families would suffer the same fate. So, why did he stay? And, just as important, why was he allowed to stay? Because implicit in that diary entry about the new order was a recognition that remaining in Ireland might not be his decision, something that was already clear for loyalists in some other parts of the country. So what I'd like to do this evening is to look at three things. First, the reasons why Nugent was so determined to hang on. Secondly, the factors that may have inclined others to permit him to do so. And thirdly, to look briefly at what life was like for Nugent and his family and for others in South Cavan in 1922. So, turning first to his reasons for staying. A major reason he wanted to remain, of course, was that the Farranconnell estate was his home, and farming it, now he'd retired from the army, was his livelihood. But that in itself doesn't completely explain his determination to stay. After all, many landed families, like his friends, the Saundersons of Castle Saunderson, were in similar positions, yet chose to leave. In Nugent's case, there were a number of personal factors that made him want to stay, and in particular, his sense of identity, his sense of place, and the way his political views had evolved, especially between 1914 and 1922. Nugent not only regarded himself as both Irish and British, and like many of his class, saw no conflict between those two identities, but he also saw himself very much as a man of Cavan. The Nugent's roots in the North Midlands went back to the 12th century. His ancestors had fought for the Irish Confederation in the 1640s and the Jacobites in the 1690s. And though the Nugents of Farranconnell, like their cousins, the Earls of Westmeath, converted to Protestantism to keep their lands, and by the mid-18th century had begun a tradition of service in the British Army that would continue for the next 5 generations, he was always very conscious and proud of his heritage. And that sense of history fed directly into how he reacted to events during the revolutionary period. Nugent revealingly felt that his family's deep roots in the locality gave them a different outlook to other Unionist landowners in the county. In 1917, for example, he had written from Flanders to his English wife, Kitty, about a family friend who was a staunch Ulster Unionist. And I quote, "The fact is, Anna cannot realize that there is all the difference in the world between her family and ours. She is not Irish and has not a drop of Irish blood in her veins. She is the descendant of Scotch settlers who have never intermarried with the Irish. We are Irish because we have intermarried with the Irish who owned the country before us. And he continued, referring to his involvement with the UVF in 1914. The excitement that caused is really proof of how much the country people look upon Nugents as their natural leaders, because they considered I had deserted the side I ought by heredity to be in sympathy with. Well, I hope it won't be long before we're back amongst them, though I fear it will be at least 2 years." End quote. Now, some of that was just wishful thinking, though the note of affection for Cavan and its people was certainly genuine. But it's interesting how he airbrushed out of his family history the other families from whom he was descended, because the reality was that from the 18th century onwards, the Nugents didn't intermarry with the Irish, as he'd put it, but into what he might be described as classic settler families. His mother was a Lytton, his paternal grandmother a Rathborne, his great-grandmother a Irvine, and so on. He himself married Kitty Leese from Dorset. But those connections didn't dilute his strong sense of his Irish roots. And linked to that was his sense of place, and specifically of belonging to Farran Connell, the estate just outside Mountnugent beside Loch Sheelin. Nugent was deeply attached to Farran Connell, which he inherited in 1881 on his 21st birthday. But when he was born in 1860, the chances of him inheriting it seemed non-existent. His father, an army officer, was the youngest of 6 brothers, 2 of whom had sons ahead of Oliver in line of inheritance, while he himself had an older brother. By the 1880s, however, the accidents of mortality and the terms of his grandfather's will had transformed the situation. In 1865, his brother St. George had died, aged 6, and in 1876, his only surviving male cousin, Edmund, who had inherited Farran Connell, died childless at the age of 37. And so, when Nugent came of age, the estate passed to him, though for a time his father ran it on his behalf. Part of Oliver Nugent's lifelong commitment to Farran Connell may therefore have stemmed from the fortuitous circumstances in which he succeeded to it. With the property, though, came significant financial burdens, which in turn would influence his military career. When he inherited, the estate was already saddled with significant debts, and almost immediately the financial position got much worse, for 2 reasons. The first was the plan of campaign, the continuation into the early 1880s of the land war, which led to his tenants refusing to pay their rents without significant reductions. And the second was Nugent's own extravagance. In 1882, he'd been commissioned into the Royal Munster Fusiliers, where he spent an unhappy 9 months before transferring to the more prestigious and much more expensive 60th Rifles, where he immediately became plunged into debt, buying expensive outfits, losing money heavily at gambling, and so on. By 1886, things were so bad that he concluded miserably that he would have both to resign his commission and sell Farran Connell, to the fury of his formidable mother. His father had died in 1884. She blamed his fecklessness for the impending loss of the family home and suggested he should enlist as a private soldier after sending in his papers. But at the last minute, he changed his mind and decided to transfer to the 4th Battalion of his regiment in India to try to save money. In September 1886, he left Ireland, writing in his diary, "Said a long goodbye to my dear old home. Mother, Cyril, O Lord, and Harry, all grieved at my going, and I heart sorry to leave the old house I may never see again. God protect it in my absence, and send it and us better days." It is one of the paradoxes of Nugent's career that in order to preserve the home he loved, he spent most of his life away from it. Between 1882 and 1920, when he retired from the army, he spent more than 20 years overseas, in India, South Africa, and on the Western Front, and for only 5 years was he based in Ireland. And as we can see, this jokey little cartoon on the lower right, which he drew probably in 1892 when returning to India after leave, shows him saying goodbye at Oldcastle Station and has at the bottom a reference to rivers of tears. Nevertheless, the decision to go to India was the making of his military career. The 10 years he spent there brought him operational experience on the northwest frontier, a decoration for gallantry at the Malakand Pass, and entry to the Staff College, which prepared the way for future promotion. It also saved the estate. He was able to reduce expenditure in India, but Farron Connell couldn't have been kept going without the efforts of others, including money provided by his mother Emily, the dowry that Kitty brought with her on their marriage in 1899, and the careful management of the estate for almost 40 years by William Tatlow, Nugent's Dublin-based agent, and his son. In fact, the appointment of the Tatlows in 1886 was one of the best decisions Nugent ever made, and the families became very close, so much so indeed that when Nugent's mother died in 1922, she was buried in the Tatlow family plot at Dean's Grange in Dublin. So in 1922, part of Nugent's determination to stay on at Farron Connell stemmed from the sacrifices he and others had made to preserve it. But from his return to Ireland in the summer of 1920 until the end of the Civil War, the sense of threat to Farron Connell was constant. Kitty, his wife, would write later that during this period, on several occasions, Nugent's quick wit, as she put it, saved his family, the household, and home in a tight corner. And we'll come to a couple of those incidents in 1922 in just a moment. But the third factor that shaped Nugent's attitude to staying on was the development of his political views during the 1914 to 22 period. Oliver Nugent was a committed unionist, but a key point about him is that though he was a unionist from Ulster, he wasn't really an Ulster unionist. He was strongly opposed to Home Rule for the entire island, not just for Ulster, and he didn't support partition. And so one of the themes of the years from 1914 onwards is his increasing divergence from the Ulster Unionist leadership. 4 episodes illustrate the evolution of Nugent's political views in this period, which we'll run through in turn. The Home Rule crisis of 1914, the aftermath of the 1916 Rising, the defeat of the Cavan Unionists in the Ulster Unionist Council, or UUC, in 1920, and his speech at a memorial event in Limavady in 1922 after the creation of the Free State and Northern Ireland. His involvement with the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1914 was a slightly strange episode, and one about which he subsequently felt deeply uncomfortable. He became involved only because his friend, Arthur Maxwell, Lord Farnham, pressed him to take command of the Cavan Volunteers. This placed him in an awkward position because he was still a serving officer, albeit at that point between postings. He agreed to do so only on the basis that the Cavan Volunteers, under his leadership, would be a purely defensive force to protect local unionists in the event of attack and acting in cooperation with the police and army if necessary. That didn't match the more aggressive stance of the wider Ulster Unionist leadership, and nor did his publicly stated opposition to partition, splashed over the front page of the nationalist Anglo-Celt in March 1914. If Home Rule couldn't be prevented for Ireland as a whole, then he believed the least bad option was special protections for Ulster in an all-Ireland parliament. His essentially Southern Unionist views were already at odds, therefore, with those of Craig and other senior Ulster Unionist figures. This evening isn't the occasion to look in detail at his career during the Great War, other than to note that he was a very capable and effective commander. He led the Ulster Division with distinction in its 5 biggest battles: the Somme, Messines, Third Ypres, Cambrai, and the German 1918 Spring Offensive. But Irish politics, of course, didn't stop just because there was a war on. The Ulster Division was unionism's most iconic contribution to the war effort, and the tensions within Irish unionism had been transported with it to the Western Front. As early as November 1915, for example, Wilfred Spender, an officer on Nugent's staff close to Craig and Carson, who reported back to them everything Nugent said or did, told his wife Lily, "General Nugent is not at all keen about a separate Ulster and would willingly compromise with the Nationalist Party if it meant support by the government. There is no fervour about his faith in this respect, and he will want watching later, after the war. I think Sir Edward ought to know this." The decisive moment in Nugent's deteriorating relationship with the Unionist leadership came in June 1916, when the UUC, in the political negotiations following the Easter Rising, accepted Lloyd George's proposal for partition based on the 6 northeastern counties and excluding Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal. This decision, taken just 3 weeks before the Ulster Division went over the top on the first day of the Somme, caused much bitterness amongst officers and soldiers from the 3 affected counties, Nugent amongst them. And Farnham, now Nugent's ADC, returned home as leader of the Cavan Unionists to argue without success against the plan. Although the negotiations broke down a few weeks later, Nugent was clear from this point on that partition was inevitable and that Cavan Unionists like him would have to accommodate themselves to that reality. This was in contrast to Farnham, who still thought the position could be retrieved. He would find out differently in 1920. By 1917, Nugent and James Craig were scarcely on speaking terms, and the extent of the breakdown in their relationship is revealed by Craig's unsuccessful attempt that year to engineer Nugent's removal from command of the Ulster Division. In May 1918, Douglas Haig, with whom Nugent's relations had always been difficult, replaced him with a younger officer, and he was sent to India to command a district there. In June 1920, he retired from the army, and he and Kitty returned to Ireland. By the time Nugent arrived back at Farranconnell, Cavan Unionism had already suffered its final political defeat. In March 1920, Farnham made an attempt in the UUC to have Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal included in the territory of the new Northern Ireland, a proposal heavily defeated by the 6 county delegates. Nugent had expected this outcome, but it didn't stop him from feeling the same resentment that many other Cavan loyalists did. In 1924, when explaining the operation of the Boundary Commission to one of his daughters, he wrote of what had happened in 1920, and I quote, "There was a great deal of talk, but in the end, 3 counties of Ulster were excluded from the area which refused to come under an Irish Parliament. The point is interesting, as the present attitude of many Northern speakers is to assert that they were deprived of 3 of the 9 counties of Ulster, and that therefore they will not submit to having more taken from them. The truth being that they would not have taken more than the 6 counties at any price." And he went on, "The slogan now raised of not an inch of land, not a Protestant, comes with doubtful sincerity and no consistency from the people who had no hesitation in abandoning the whole of their co-religionists and the rest of Ireland to the mercies of men whose creed, so the Ulster leaders and Orangemen said, was destruction to the Protestant religion and who were unfit to govern anyone." End quote. And some of this frustration would surface publicly in a speech he made in Limavady in March 1922. As soon as he arrived back in Ireland in 1920, Nugent had thrown himself into commemorating those who had died in the war and assisting those who returned. In the same way that during the war he'd hoped shared service at the front would have a unifying effect politically, he now saw the commemoration of shared sacrifice as potentially serving the same purpose. He was in considerable demand. Between 1920 and 1926, he would unveil memorials in Belfast, Virginia, Kells, Ballymena and Lisbon, as well as participating in the opening of the Ulster Tower in France. At all these events, his speeches contained common themes: gratitude for the sacrifice of the dead, sympathy for the bereaved, praise for those who had volunteered, and encouragement of reconciliation. His speech in Limavady in 1922 was, however, more overtly political than the others. The Limavady Memorial was unusual in that, rather than a monument, it was a building intended to provide practical help to veterans with a library, recreation rooms, and so on. Nugent, in his address, welcomed the building's purpose, and did so, according to the press, in markedly anti-partitionist terms. Part of his speech read, quote, "It would help them reach the ideal which all true Irishmen had at heart, and to which they were all looking forward, and that was a united and happy Ireland, an Ireland prosperous and contented. If that building helped to bring men of different aspirations and views together to hear each other's opinions, it would do infinitely more good than any memorial stone could do," end quote. There was more in the same vein, including a reference to one people who should not be divided. The newspapers reported that the audience applauded the speech warmly, though whether everyone applauded equally enthusiastically is unclear. The use of phrases like a united Ireland and one people suggests that just 9 months after the formation of Northern Ireland and 3 after the signing of the treaty, Nugent, like other Southern ex-Unionists, still hoped for rapprochement between the two jurisdictions that might bring them together as a single entity within the empire. His remarks also echoed other disappointed Cavan loyalist commentators in implicitly challenging the validity of the assumptions underpinning partition. One reason Nugent was content to remain in Cavan was that like other Southern loyalists, he felt only limited affinity with the new Northern Ireland state and none at all with its political leaders. This was despite having many friends and relatives there and his deep regard for the thousands of officers and men who had served under him, nearly all of whom were, of course, strong Ulster Unionists. The absence of similar references in his future speeches indicates that the hope of early reconciliation between the two parts of Ireland faded quickly. And it also shows that he knew his audience. Speaking to an assembly in the west of the province that included numbers of veterans from Donegal was a different matter to addressing gatherings in Ballymena and Belfast in the Unionist heartland. Which brings us on to the factors outside Nugent's control that may have helped him in staying on, and why he was left relatively unmolested despite his background. His and Kitty's return to Farranconnell in the summer of 1920 coincided with a dramatic escalation in the levels of violence. The great majority of the 1,800 or so politically related deaths in Ireland during the War of Independence occurred between July 1920 and July 1921. A characteristic of the violence, however, was its uneven distribution. Cavan had one of the lowest death tolls in the country, with just a dozen or so fatalities, compared to well over 500 in Cork, of course a much bigger county. Why Cavan, with its sizable Protestant population and proximity to the new Northern Ireland, was spared the bloodshed seen elsewhere is a topic for another day. But it's perhaps just worth noting that in Cavan and in neighbouring counties like Meath and Westmeath, the nationalist political victory was as comprehensive as anywhere else, without mercifully having to endure the bloodletting. Whatever the reasons, however, it was fortunate for Nugent that the conflict in Cavan never reached the ferocity it did in parts of Munster. Kitty later attributed the fact that the family survived the Troubles relatively unscathed to Nugent's being much respected and loved in the neighbourhood. But had they lived near, say, Bandon rather than Ballyjamesduff, that might not have been enough to safeguard him or his home. But beyond the general point about patterns of violence across the country, there are, I think, 3 specific reasons why Nugent and his property weren't targeted more aggressively. The first was a very practical one. He continued to live at Farranconnell. And while that might have left him at greater risk of personal attack, it certainly reduced the risk to the house. A feature of the War of Independence and Civil War was the widespread destruction of property by all sides, including the burning by Republicans of big houses, mostly Unionist owned. While Cavan was less affected than some other areas, several such houses were destroyed, and vacant houses were at particular risk. Stradone House, the home of close friends of the Nugents, the Burrows, had, for example, been burnt the previous year, and the residence of the Maxwell family, Arley, near Farranconnell, which had been standing empty, was so badly damaged by looters it had to be demolished. Kitty later recalled that we were given indirectly to understand that as long as he, Nugent, or any of his family were in the house, it would not be burned down. That assurance, whatever its source, was honoured. Nevertheless, the threat to Farron Connell was constantly on Nugent's mind. A second factor that reduced the risk to the Nugents was that before the war, he had ceased to be a landlord. Between 1904 and 1908, he had had the good sense, both politically and economically, to sell off most of his estate to his tenants under the terms of the Wyndham Land Act. Much apparently political violence against former landlords in the revolutionary period really stemmed from agrarian grievances, so the sale of most of the estate had removed a major potential source of friction with the local community. But even so, Nugent was still a landowner with 500 acres, and in 1922, land hunger was as prevalent in the North Midlands as in other parts of rural Ireland. We mentioned earlier the case of Louisa Heppenstall, the 50-year-old Protestant spinster with a nearby farm who arrived at Farron Connell one night in May, too frightened to stay in her house, to which she never returned. Nugent heard that the blackguards who have hunted Miss Heppenstall out boasted that they would now clear Thompson's out of Ross and then do the same to me, and added in his diary, "How long shall we be able to remain here?" In fact, he wasn't subjected to the same direct intimidation, though, as we noted, his barn was burnt in January 1922, and there were constant episodes of trespass and poaching, the theft of timber, and so on, all of which added to the pervading sense of insecurity. But the third factor that almost certainly reduced animosity against him was his political views. He was well known as a unionist, of course, but his anti-partitionist views were equally well known. And during the 1914 Home Rule crisis, he had at least attempted to keep up a dialogue with local nationalist political representatives. For example, by writing to a local councillor, William Ahern, explaining his position and offering a meeting to discuss their differences. The offer wasn't taken up, but there was a good deal of mutual respect there, as we'll see. After his return from India, Nugent played no role personally in the War of Independence, though many of those he had served with did. During the war, he'd hoped that shared experience of service would bring Unionists and Nationalists closer together politically. But in the Anglo-Irish War and the parallel sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland, ex-servicemen were involved on all sides, thousands serving in the RIC, IRA, Ulster Special Constabulary, and other armed groups. Several of his former subordinates from the Ulster Division held senior police commands in the north, and one, Frank Percy Crozier, shown here, commanded the auxiliary division of the RIC from its formation in 1920 until his controversial resignation in February 1921. Nugent undoubtedly regarded the government's hardline, not to say unprincipled, security policy in 1920-21 as wholly counterproductive. Crozier later wrote that Nugent strongly disapproved of the behaviour of the auxiliaries in Black and Tans and had told him they should never have been deployed in Ireland because they weren't gentlemen. And his activity by the police and military in South Cavan intensified in early 1921. Nugent intervened to secure the risk of, as Kitty put it, the son of a poor widow taken off by the Black and Tans under the eyes of his mother in her own cottage. And she believed it was only through Nugent's ceaseless demands that the young man was released unharmed. Interventions like this help explain why Nugent remained well regarded locally. Yet even so, it remains surprising, given the symbolism of his role as commander of the Ulster Division, that he didn't attract more attention from militant Republicans. Indeed, it's striking that the only senior Irish general of the First World War to be killed between 1919 and 1923, Henry Wilson, was assassinated in London, an event Nugent wrote in June 1922 that had horrified the civilized world. Even though across Ireland, scores of lower-ranking ex-servicemen lost their lives. The motives for those killings remain a matter of historical dispute, but it wasn't through a lack of more senior potential targets. In addition to Nugent, both Brian Mahon and William Hickey, commanders respectively of the 10th and 16th Irish Divisions, along with a dozen other former Great War generals, were resident in the 26 county area, their addresses conveniently listed in publications like Walford's County Families. Several had public profiles through commemoration and other events, while Hickey and Mahon would in 1922 be appointed to the Irish Senate. Yet, though several suffered harassment, some left Ireland and a number of houses were attacked, there was no coordinated lethal campaign against them as a group, and nor were their homes systematically earmarked for destruction because of their military backgrounds. Wilson was targeted because of his political activities, and Mahon's Kildare home was burnt by anti-treaty forces because he was a senator. IRA policy, it seems, as well as local regard, may have helped preserve Farron-Connell. So, his continued residence, the prior sale of much of the estate, and his moderate political views all helped reduce, to a degree, the risks Nugent faced. But they didn't remove all the risk or the sense of vulnerability. And that brings us, finally, to everyday life for the Nugents and others in 1922. The atmosphere in Cavan in the early months of 1922, following the signing of the treaty in December, was somewhat surreal. The process of withdrawing the British Army and disbanding the RIC had begun immediately, and in several areas the RIC and the Irish Republican Police cooperated to maintain order. And in Clonus, a battalion of Nugent's own regiment, the 60th Rifles, which had been deployed in Monaghan and North Cavan, held well-attended public band concerts while preparing to leave. One of its patrols in May 1921 had been involved in one of the few fatal military actions in Cavan at Drung, in which an IRA volunteer was killed. But that didn't prevent the battalion receiving a presentation in Clonus Town Hall to mark their departure. On the same weekend, a large dance was being held in the town for returned IRA internees. As the formal transfer of responsibility for law and order to the new government continued, it wasn't always clear what the status was of armed groups claiming authority. On the 27th of March, Nugent recorded, "This afternoon, 5 men, partly in uniform, stating that they belonged to the IRA from Cavan, came here demanding loan of my car. On my refusal, they took it and drove off. What a country and what people. There is unlikely I shall ever see the car again, or if I do, it will be fit to use. There is absolutely no redress, as there is no law in Ireland now. I feel the indignity of the outrage more than the loss of a Ford." And he added, "I'm glad it wasn't a good car." And yet, relations between this retired British general and the IRA in the Mountnugent area were in some ways surprisingly correct. On the 1st of May, Nugent received a threatening letter, purportedly from the local IRA commander who lived nearby. Nugent immediately went to his house and found him not in, but he called at Farron-Connell that evening and denied, as Nugent had suspected, that the letter had come from him. At the end of the month, 2 IRA men came, Nugent wrote, to ask for subscriptions for the volunteers. Told them if I subscribed, it could only be as blackmail, so they went away. Should probably have given them money if they had waited or had a less insolent spokesman. One of the men whom Nugent didn't know had been aggressive. Although the IRA at this time were under instructions not to extract contributions by force, this was an exchange that in another part of the country might well have ended differently. Even more worrying was the evidence of intensifying divisions between pro and anti-treaty supporters in the south, accompanied by increasing sectarian violence in the north. In February 1922, Nugent's diary listed a series of violent events, including mass kidnappings along the new border, a confrontation at Clonus railway station between the IRA and Ulster Special Constabulary members, which left an IRA officer and 4 specials dead, and heavy fighting in Belfast. 43 people were killed there in February. On the 25th of March, he recorded the shocking murder of a whole Catholic family in Belfast, a reference to the killing by renegade police of 6 members of the McMahon household. Nor were the deaths confined to the northeast. On the 29th of April, he noted shocking murders of Protestants in County Cork, presumably reprisals for the murder of Catholics in Belfast. This was the so-called Bandon Valley massacre, when 13 Protestants were killed by Republicans. Given the subsequent controversy over the motivation for the killings, it's interesting that Nugent's immediate assumption was that the violence in Ulster and Munster was linked. In May, following the internment by the Northern government of 300 nationalists, nearly all of course Catholics, he commented, "I wish I could see that some other denominations have been arrested too." His concern wasn't just a desire for even-handedness. He saw Southern Protestants as hostages for what was happening in the North, noting that, "I fear there will be reprisals in this part, and I have no hope in Collins or De Valera." He watched the continuing slide towards civil war in the South with alarm. With the capture of the Four Courts in June, he was cautiously optimistic, but his optimism disappeared in August with news of the deaths of Griffith and Collins. And the conflict, now in its guerrilla phase, soon came closer to home. In a 3-week period in late August and September, for example, within a few miles of Farranconnell, the Oldcastle bank manager was held up and attempts were made to raid banks in Ballyjamesduff in Virginia. The Mountnugent post office was robbed by armed men. The former RIC barracks in Ballina, recently vacated by the Free State Army, was burned. And most seriously, on the 22nd of September, the government-held barracks in Oldcastle was captured by a large force of irregulars after a prolonged gun battle in which a civilian was killed. Yet in the midst of all this, the Nugents and their friends tried to maintain some kind of normality. Kitty joined other county grandees at the Cavan show on the 6th of September. The Rotherhams, the Featherstone Hawes and Lady Longford came separately to tea at Farranconnell that week. And Nugent and Kitty spent a few days in London to settle their daughter Alison back into school and meet St. George, who joined his father's regiment on his return from India. But the day after Nugent's return to Farranconnell, 5 men raided the house for arms. They accepted Nugent's word that there were no guns in the house and left, but he wrote, "The indignity of living under conditions where one is at the mercy of such people is intolerable." His son, St. George, just a few weeks earlier, had implored his father to get the family out of Ireland, but Nugent, as we've seen, was determined to stay if he could. Other long-standing friends reached a different conclusion, and around a quarter of the landed families who had formed part of the Nugent's pre-war social network had left Ireland by 1925. But that, of course, also means that 3/4 didn't leave, and not all of those who did left permanently. In July 1922, Nugent met Arthur Farnham living under police protection in London. Nugent wrote in his diary, "He can get no rents and is absolutely broke. Poor old boy. He deserves a better career than to be a diehard, in no one's interest except of the politicians in the north of Ireland who sacrificed him for their own purposes." Yet the Farnhams would return to live in Cavan full-time in 1927. Nugent's diary entries for the closing weeks of 1922 remain bleak. On the 25th of November, he recorded that Erskine Childers has been shot, a poor sort of ending to what, by all accounts, might have been a brilliant life. I think the Free State government was right. They could not let off the leaders and shoot the followers. In the absence of Nugent's diary for the following year, it's unclear what he made of the increasingly severe reprisals of early 1923. But as his comments on Childers' execution reveal, he certainly believed the Dublin government had to take whatever steps it needed to survive. The year 1922 closed, therefore, with uncertainty and anxiety hanging over the Nugents of Farranconnell, as they did over many other Southern loyalists. Yet, moving forward 2 years, Nugent's 1924 and 1925 diaries paint a very different picture. In Mountnugent and the surrounding areas, life for those landed ex-Unionists who had managed to hang on settled down remarkably quickly after the Civil War. The experience of their counterparts in other places, including Monaghan, was sometimes quite different. Although their world had changed radically in some respects, in others, familiar patterns were reasserting themselves. Country sports had resumed, and friends from Northern Ireland and Britain, as well as the Free State, came to Farranconnell to shoot and fish, while the round of house calls to an admittedly smaller number of big houses continued. Nugent threw himself into running Farranconnell and brought to the task the same focus and attention to detail that had characterized his military career. A saying amongst the estate workers was that no job at Farranconnell was finished until it had been done twice. He was appointed to the Agricultural Committee of the Royal Dublin Society and was a member of the Church of Ireland's General Synod. All certainly wasn't perfect. The estate experienced ongoing financial difficulties, while some petty interdenominational incidents were suggestive of wider sectarian tensions. Yet Nugent had little difficulty in adjusting to life in the Free State. He fitted into the same mold of adaptive coexistence that Jonathan Cherry has ascribed to Lord Farnham, and Nugent probably did so the more easily because of his own sense of his Irish roots and because he had been reconciled sooner to the prospect of life in an independent Ireland. Like Arthur Farnham, he retained his British allegiance, expressed in his case principally through his continuing military connections. In addition to his commemorative activities, he regularly attended regimental events and Ulster Division reunion dinners in London and Belfast. And he supported William Hickey's efforts to assist ex-servicemen, which led to the formation of the Southern Ireland branch of the British Legion. He saw no conflict between these ingrained loyalties and acceptance of the institutions of the new state, and in 1925 he and Kitty voted in the Dáil elections for the first time. Nugent died quite suddenly of pneumonia in May 1926, his health weakened by war service and a recent operation. The photographs of him in 1913 and 1923 show how much he'd aged. Amongst the many letters of condolence Kitty received was one from the widow of William Ahern, the nationalist councillor who had been one of Nugent's pre-war opponents over Home Rule, who wrote, "General Nugent was always very popular in the district, and his loss will be very much felt. He and my late husband had differences on political questions, but the latter always thought him a great soldier, a great loyalist, and a great Irishman. That was certainly a tribute Nugent would have particularly appreciated." And there I'll stop. Thank you for listening.